Recording.
Good. So let's go ahead and finish up urinary. So last time we were talking about GFR, glomerular filtration rate, and the different components of GFR. Now we're talking about the control of your glomerular filtration rate, right? So we have obviously autoregulation as local level control. Notice a pattern here. This is always the pattern we've set down in all these chapters, right? Autoregulation, local controllers, then of course hormonal, and then nervous system, global nervous system. So the autoregulators are local guys. Basically, this is going to be local, just sort of day-to-day regulation of pressure and blood flow. This is mostly driven by the afferent and efferent arterioles. So these are the regulators for that blood flow and pressure as it goes into the glomerulus. And typically what you're doing here is just changing the diameter. And so you're basically dilating or constricting each of these two in order to get specific pressure effects and blood flow effects as it goes through the glomerulus. So you can imagine then as the blood is flowing through the glomerulus, that these two are constantly sort of in this sort of constriction dilation. They're kind of constantly playing off each other, basically trying to fine tune and get the perfect combination of pressure and blood flow as it flows through the glomerulus. Now, when you take a look at the blood flow or pressure, generally speaking, that's not a good thing, right? Because you need good blood flow to get good exchange. You need that filtration pressure, right? So you need also pressure as well. And so generally speaking, when you have a reduced flow, this is going to dilate the afferent, right? This increases your flow because you get more blood in there because you dilated the afferent or the arriving arterial. You also dilate the glomerular capillaries, which basically increases flow in the glomerulus. And then you constrict the efferent arterioles, which limits outflow. So you're not losing your flow to the efferent system. So it kind of bottles the blood up in the glomerulus and kind of increases flow and pressure so that you can get better filtration. Now then, if you have blood pressure increase, so this is an increase in blood pressure response, then basically what's going to happen is you're going to dilate your afferent arterioles, or they're going to stretch, right? So you're going to stretch these arterioles themselves. That's going to trigger reflexively the smooth muscles to do a contraction to fight against that stretch. And then when this constricts the afferent arterioles, it decreases the blood flow. So basically blood flow itself and pressure, blood, triggers a constriction reflex. So this is kind of what we talked about. So if you have really, really hot blood pressure coming in to the afferent, it's naturally going to respond. It's going to push against that, constricting it, protecting the glomerulus, reducing that blood flow. Because otherwise what would happen is that flaming red hot pressure would come into your glomerulus, blow up your glomerular capillaries, and that would be a bad situation, right? So this is kind of a reflexive sort of a thing. So when you take a look at the autoregulation, let's start off with our homeostasis. This is our normal glomerular filtration rate, or GFR. If we decrease our GFR, that's going to decrease our filtrate in our urine production, so that's not a good thing. This decrease is then going to trigger the dilation of your afferent arterioles, which increases your blood flow. So that's your blood flow and pressure. Then you constrict the efferent arterioles, which also increases blood flow and blood pressure in the glomerulus. The other thing that we haven't really mentioned is the mesangial cells. And mesangial cells are a group of cells that you see in the glomerulus. We actually saw them very quickly when we took a look at the glomerulus and we saw those filtration slits, right? Those podocytes that were sort of resting on top of the glomerulus itself. Well, there's another group of cells that are sort of laying right in there called mesangial cells. And these are one of those dual hybrid cells, right? So we have neurosecretory and conductive contractile, right? So those kind of dual role cells. This is a dual role cell. In this case, it is an epithelial cell. It's actually classified as an epithelial cell, but it has contractile ability. So it's kind of a contractile epithelial cell. And so they don't do a lot of global. It's not like a muscle cell. It's not like a smooth muscle. So it's not the same thing. It's an epithelial cell. But it has the ability to do kind of like small local contraction, which is just enough to kind of create a little bit of contraction in the actual glomerulus itself. And this will basically contract a little bit on the glomerular capillaries. And all this basically will increase your blood pressure in the glomerulus, which will restore your GFR back to normal. Okay, this is all kind of normal stuff. This is like day-to-day operations. Your kidneys are doing this right now, right? And just the normal operation, the manipulation of just your second by second changes and fluctuations in pressure and things like that. Now then, we also have hormonal regulation of GFR, and guess what? Our old friend is back, right? Notice I told you at the beginning of the semester, you're never going to get away from RAS. And here it is again, for the third time, by the way, if you're keeping track. This is the third time. And so our RAS system is part of the hormonal system of GFR, and also our natriuretic peptides. We've already seen them once, right? So they're back. So this is an important thing. So we first talked about these guys in regulation of blood pressure, but because blood pressure and blood volume and blood flow are important in the glomerulus, they're back, right? So the pressure regulation of the RAS system is important. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of this to its connection to the kidneys, right? Before we just sort of glancingly sort of brushed over the kidney component, but now we're going to focus on the kidneys collaboration with the RAS system. So the first thing that happens in our RAS system is, generally speaking, you get, say, for instance, a decline in blood pressure. And this is blood pressure coming into the glomerulus, usually because most of your blood is made out of water. That's also represented as a decrease in blood volume, which is a problem. And that's usually mirrored in a fall in systemic pressure. The important thing is what's happening in the glomerulus is kind of like a microcosm of what's happening systemically across your cardiovascular system. Okay, so this is just kind of like a little bit of some triggers of what will trigger this juxtaglomerular complex, including the JG cells. So the JG cells are the ones that are really kind of have their finger in the blood pressure component, and they're basically measuring this blood pressure. And when they do, they release renin, which is the first component of the RAS system. And so this is sensed because those JG cells are constantly measuring the glomerular pressure going in there. It also will be stimulated by sympathetic innervation. So basically, if you start running for your life, that's also going to stimulate the JG cells as well, because you're obviously going to be changing your blood pressure because you're increasing your cardiac output in order to run away from the lion, right? So that's going to be changing or stimulating your JG cells as well in terms of stimulation of renin. And if you have a decline in osmotic concentration of your tubular fluid, this is your filtrate. That's what's inside your filtrate. And in particular, not just the filtrate anywhere, but your filtrate in your DCT. This is going to be sensed by the macula densa, right? Because remember, we said the macula densa is that condensed mash of cells that's actually part of the DCT. And at that point, what we're talking about is osmotic concentration. We're really talking about sodium, right? Because sodium is the osmotic lure. It's what's causing water to move back and forth. And so you have a couple of different things, right? Because the idea here is you have two sensors. You have a decline in the osmotic lure, which would suggest that that's going to ultimately yield in a drop in blood volume, because that's going to be unfavorable for water retention. The other thing then is, of course, the direct consequence of that loss of water, which would be the blood pressure crash, right? And the reduction in volume, and that's what the JG cells. So in reality, the JG cells in the macula densa are working kind of both sides of the coin, right? One is sort of measuring what's happening on the head side. The other one's measuring what's happening on the tail side. And so they're kind of measuring both sides of that kind of osmotic relationship as it has effects on blood pressure. So then when you take a look at the renin production, ultimately, the goal is to activate angiotensin 2. And so if you recall, the trajectory for this is renin will convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, right, which will travel through the bloodstream up to the lungs, where we saw before the last chapter, a couple chapters ago actually now, where the angiotensin converting enzyme resides, right, in those capillaries, and that converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, which is then distributed throughout the rest of the body. And so angiotensin 2 actually does a lot. So one of the things that it does is it actually stimulates constriction of the efferent arterioles, the nephron, right? This is basically going to elevate your pressures, which is what you want, right? So this is going to be a blood pressure increaser, because the idea here is if you're activating the RAS system, your blood pressures have declined, they've dropped, right? So this is exactly what you want. So you constrict your efferent arterioles, that's going to increase your blood pressure, which will increase your rate. You're going to be having a stronger push against that filtration membrane. The other thing it also does, which is kind of like a little bit of a review, is it reabsorbs sodium ions. So it uptakes sodium ions, and it's doing this largely in the proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, that's the site of reabsorption for the most part. So it's stimulating the PCT to reabsorb sodium ions. It also will secrete aldosterone, right? By who? Our favorite friend, adrenal cortex. We learned about that one in chapter 18, who's making aldosterone, and aldosterone is then also going to be working with the angiotensin 2 to reabsorb those sodium ions, right? So aldosterone is part of that reabsorption of sodium ions component. It's going to trigger your thirst sensors in your brain, making you crave water. So you basically are adding new fluids to your system. And then it's going to stimulate the release of ADH from your posterior pituitary, right? Or the neurohypophysis. And then the ADH will work in conjunction with the others to basically reabsorb water, to get that water. And it's doing this typically at the location of the distal convoluted tubule. So this is where that water retention of ADH activity is happening. So then it does a little bit more though. That's a lot of review, but angiotensin 2 does a lot. This is the reason why it's a huge target of ours in terms of blood pressure regulation. It also, in addition to all of this, has an effect on sympathetic motor tone. So basically, angiotensin 2 is a positive factor for sympathetic motor tone. So if you're this tonality, remember this is a state of readiness that you're always at. So it has an improved state of readiness. So your sympathetic motor tone is like ready to go. It's like you're ready to jump out of your skin at that moment's notice, because you're like in a state of readiness. And so it does this by, first of all, mobilizing your venous reserve, so increasing ultimately your stroke volume, which will increase your cardiac output, which typically will increase your blood pressure, right? So that'll increase your cardiac output. And it also has an effect on your systemic vasculature. So it'll actually stimulate peripheral vasoconstriction. This is basically of systemic arterioles, which will increase blood pressure. So angiotensin 2 has a far reach. I mean, it touches everything. Everybody's touched by angiotensin 2. It can also create bursts of vasoconstriction, especially of local arterioles and the precapillary sphincters. This increases blood flow, both in the nephron and systemically. And then that basically will have the effect of elevating your blood pressures throughout the body. So this is the reason why angiotensin 2 is a very common target when you're looking at blood pressure regulation if you're a heart patient. Now, aldosterone, which we met many times before, it's becoming an old friend for us now, right? So aldosterone, we know, is associated with the uptake of sodium reabsorption. And a lot of this will happen in the PCT does sodium reabsorption, the DCT does a lot of this. But aldosterone really has its effect in the DCT and in that cortical portion of the collecting system, like the collecting duct. Okay. And so what it does basically is it essentially we'll take a look at the mechanism of how aldosterone works and also how ADH works as we start to make filtrate. But this is basically how it looks. This is your RAS system in its full glory, right? So basically you're going to have your endocrine response, your JG complex, which is going to be producing renin. Then of course, renin will basically lead to ultimately the production of angiotensin 2. So these are all angiotensin 2 at the top here. And so a couple of these we know very well, right? So ultimately, this is going to cause the increase of aldosterone, which retains sodium, increase in your fluid consumption, your increased fluid retention, the constriction of your venous reservoirs, your increased cardiac output. So this is all like your nervous component here that's stimulated by these neural responses in conjunction with angiotensin 2. And so as part of this, you have, caused by this directly is your thirst centers, which will increase fluid consumption, right? So you get thirsty, so you drink. And then of course your ADH, which is fluid retention. So you have two things going on, and it's all going through your nervous system. So basically you increase your fluid retention with ADH and aldosterone, by the way, and you also increase your fluid intake by drinking more. So you get thirstier, 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 and you go for that. And then of course down here, your last piece of your nervous system response is your motor tone, your sympathetic motor tone, which all basically works together to increase blood volume, which increases your blood pressure systemically, which will have a direct downstream effect on your glomerular pressure, which then increases your GFR. Wow. So that's RAS in its full glory. But notice there's a lot going on there, and there's multiple systems involved in all of this, which is the reason why we can't unload RAS on you in its full glory at the beginning. We have to take some time to sort of walk our way through the different systems first before we can put them all together in the RAS system. But basically what you have now is angiotensin 2, which is a regulator for GFR, but it does so through this sort of long circuitous route because it has to change systemic pressure, and then that requires a whole lot of extra work. Okay. So then we've mentioned these now in passing. We need to now define them specifically. That's reabsorption versus secretion. And so reabsorption, at least with respect to the urinary system, is essentially the recovery of use from here. This is basically when tubular cells take back a metabolite. So you got all this stuff floating around in the filtrate now. And if you like looking through it and you're picking through it and you're like, you know, I'm gonna hang on to that for a little while longer. That's reabsorption. So you take that back and then it goes back into your bloodstream. Okay, so you reclaim it. This is a reclamation. Secretion is the opposite. Secretion is basically the dumping. So this basically dumps stuff into the filtrate. So, hey, do you want this? No, just go ahead and toss it in the Goodwill pile, right? So that's like secretion, okay? So typically different waste products, toxins, other sorts of things that you just want to get rid of. So you'll dump those into the filtration stream. And the combination of reabsorption and secretion is basically kind of what makes up the process of turning your filtrate, which is very plasma-like at the beginning, into something that's very non-plasma-like, like urine. Okay. So obviously urine is nothing like it started out, right? It's mostly waste. It's stuff that now you feel pretty comfortable with. Yeah, haul it off, right? So there's a bit of a process though to get there. And this reabsorption secretion is something that occurs at every single step of the tubular system. So now at this particular point, what we've done is we've talked a lot about the first beginning process. We've talked about filtration a lot, and it's important. But that's basically moving those fluids into the capsular space. But now that you're in the capsular space, now it's time to start working on this reabsorption secretion process. Now that you've sort of just dumped everything in the middle of the floor, now you got to go through there and you got to pick through it and you got to make some decisions about whether or not to keep or toss. Okay, and that's what's happening in the tubular system. The first stop is going to be the proximal convoluted tubule. In the proximal convoluted tubule, we're basically going to be taking back a lot of the filtrate that we originally put in there. Up to 2/3 to almost 3/4 of our original filtrate is going to be taken back for reabsorption of different sorts of materials and things like that. Now, then what happens is once we reabsorb this, it goes through the tubular cell out into the tissue, but there is an area around the tubular system called the peritubular region. And it's there that you're going to find the capillary. So for instance, if you see, like, let's say there's the proximal convoluted tubule, your filtrate is inside. So this is out here, the peritubular fluid. It's the tissue that's outside the tube. Okay. And then typically what will happen is you'll have like a capillary running alongside it. This is the peritubular capillary. So what happens is if you reclaim something out of the tubule, then it goes into the peritubular fluid and then diffuses into the capillary. So you reclaim it into the capillary. That's basically how that works when you reclaim something. So when you take a look at the PCT itself, then it does a few things. First of all, it's going to take back some organic nutrients, some ions, and also water. So it's going to take back those three. There's going to be active reabsorption of ions. That's like active transport, right? Where you use energy in order to get those ions back because they're really, really important to you. And there's also passive reabsorption of ions. That's basically diffusing into the peritubular capillary. And then of course you have secretion of stuff. So some dumping of extra stuff into the filtrate itself. So you're reclaiming some things back. So what are some of the, let's take a look at some of the things that the PCT does. And we'll take a look at some of this a little bit up close here in just a second. We're going to take a look, first of all, at sodium ion reabsorption, because that's a big one, right? Because sodium is essentially a critical ion. We can't just let this one go. It's the basis of our nervous system, and now it's our main osmotic lure, right, for moving water around. So it's a pretty big deal. And so sodium absorption typically will diffuse through open channels called leak channels. And when it's diffusing, remember, it's following its concentration gradient. So once you actually get the sodium back, then you can use the sodium to do co-transport of organic molecules, like for instance, glucose, right? That's a good example. You're going to be taking your glucose back because some glucose does make it into the filtrate, but guess what? It took a lot of energy and a lot of work to eat that glucose in the first place, didn't it? I mean, let's think you're a mammal, you got to work for your food. So when you chase down that little rabbit and eat it, it took a lot of energy to do that. You're not going to squander all that glucose. I mean, you paid a price to get a hold of that. So you're taking that one back. And sodium happens to be your mechanism for moving that back. This is the co-transport scenario. We also have counter-transport for ions as well. So this is just positionally where it's happening. Now we're in the proximal convoluted tubule. Typically speaking, whenever you see an image like this, and we'll see these from time to time, whenever you see a solid arrow, basically that means a directional sort of a thing, a reabsorption sort of a thing. The dotted arrow usually is associated with like diffusion usually. It's like a diffusing type of movement where a solid arrow is usually active, but this is exiting of water and solutes out and some solutes coming in through secretion. So you have a little bit of secretion absorption going on. Okay, so now we see a lot of these particular images, so we need to get used to them. This is the nitty gritty. So let's kind of calibrate ourselves first of all. So this right here, these purple cells here are the cells of the tubule, of the proximal convoluted tubule. This here is the peritubular tissue, and this is your peritubular capillary. Okay. So then up here, then you have the lumen of the tubule. This is where your filtrate resides. So in this particular area, first thing you notice is we have our carbonate buffer system, right? So whenever we have a CO2, we met this one last time. And so we have basically our carbonate buffer system. There's a couple of things going on here that I want to sort of sketch out. First of all, what I want to do is I want to take a look at the carbonate component. So here basically is our carbonate buffer system. This is the basis of our acidity. And in this particular case, what we can do, say, for instance, if we're getting a little too acidic, is we can take the acidity out of the bloodstream, which will diffuse out of the bloodstream through a leak channel. So that little symbol right there is a leak channel. It's an open channel where you can just enter through by diffusion. So the hydrogen ion will enter through by diffusion. And then what we could do is we can actually actively pump out the hydrogen into the lumen of the filtrate in exchange for a sodium. So we use sodium as a counter lever in order to get the hydrogen out. Notice what you're doing though. You're moving your hydrogen ion, which is your acidity. So this is one of the major mechanisms by which you can regulate your acidity and keep your physiological pH at about 7.4. When you start to get down to 7.2, you're getting a little too acidic. One of the things you can do is basically offload the hydrogen ion into your urine stream by this exact mechanism. Okay. Now, here's the problem. Once you've eliminated that hydrogen ion, you've got this negatively charged bicarb hanging around, right? So first of all, that's a problem because there's an extra negative charge there now instead of a positive. So you've basically created charge separation, charge differential, which can be a problem. So what do you do instead? You take your bicarb and essentially you co-transport it into the peritubular tissue where then it'll diffuse into the bloodstream, alkalinizing the blood, further regulating your pH. But you do that in exchange and with the power of a sodium molecule. So you're taking in sodium as basically a manipulative for these transport mechanisms. In addition to that, you'll notice sodium will also enter the peritubular through its leak channels, where it will basically interact with a sodium potassium pump. Remember that one from AMP1? So the sodium potassium pump will basically pump a sodium into the peritubular space where it'll then diffuse into the bloodstream, thereby piling sodium up in the bloodstream. This causes the natural osmotic flow of water to come into the blood, right? Which it can do pretty much fairly freely. The other way to get sodium back into you is by using this guy right here. So there's a couple things going on here. This is a sort of a twofer, right? So in this particular case, this is your co-transport. And so here you have glucose and sodium out here in your filtrate, but you want them both. So what you do here is you send them through an active transporter, a symporter, which basically brings in sodium and glucose. So you're using sodium as a counter measure for moving glucose in. And so when both sodium and glucose moves in, you've reclaimed your glucose, which you can then take back up into your capillaries. And then you have basically 3 routes essentially for reclaiming sodium. And that basically gives you this sort of rich sodium uptake in the PCT. So when you're looking at this, there's a lot of things going on here, but these 3 things are all going, 4 things actually, these 4 things are going on all at the same time in the proximal convoluted tubule. A couple of things, you'll probably figure this out. A dotted line is diffusion, a solid line is typically an active situation, an active transporter situation. So that same kind of notational system is carried out throughout the rest of these images. So we'll see these images as we go from one part of the tubule system to the other. So now that we're done with the proximal convoluted tubule, it's time now for us to go through the nephron loop or the loop of Henle, right? And so the nephron loop or the loop of Henle uses what's called a counter current multiplication system. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But basically what's going to happen is about half of your water that's remaining in the tubular fluid after the PCT gets done with it is going to be reabsorbed. This is your take back. So you're basically taking about half of your water content back out of your filtrate and almost 2/3 of your sodium and chloride ions. So that's all coming back to you. So that's a lot. So you're reclaiming water and sodium chloride with that loop. That's basically what you're doing. But it uses, and the reason why you get so much exchange, like so much take back, more so than the PCT ever did, is because of this counter current multiplication mechanism. This is a critical physiological mechanism. So let's take a look at this. So the countercurrent multiplication idea is set up because the loop is organized in sort of like a northbound, southbound sort of a strategy, right? So there is a descending limb that's thin, that kind of goes down. And then there's a thicker ascending limb. So it kind of goes up and then it kind of spreads out. And then there's a thicker. So this is your thin descending limb and your thicker ascending limb. And basically what happens is your filtrate flow is going against each other. So they're going like this against each other. Now, why is that such a big deal? Well, here's the reason why it's a big deal. Because this is one place where we see the countercurrent multiplication strategy. The other big place in biology that we see a countercurrent multiplication strategy is in fish gills. This is actually the way they circulate water across their gills. So if you take a look at a fish gill, the fish gill is basically a series of slots, like folds, right? They're kind of like little ribbons of tissue that are highly vascular. And so they have basically, there's like curtains basically of vascular tissue is what they are. Now, when you take a look at the way, the direction of blood flow of the fish gill, the blood flow opposes the inflow of the water. So the circulation of the water through the gills is in the opposite direction as the blood flow. And there's a reason for that. Because imagine that each one of you guys is one of these like little fish gill slots. And I was oxygen coming through. So you're full of blood, right? And you're trying to recharge yourself with oxygen. So that's what they're trying to do, right? So if we're going in the same direction, and you guys understand, you're kind of moving like in this direction, right? So if I'm going in the same direction as you and I'm the flow of water, then I will be able to exchange oxygen with breathing. But because we're both moving in the same direction, we're going to always be side by side. So as we go through, we're like, okay, I already got you. Okay, I already got you. Okay, I already got you. I already got you. And then I'm out. So that means that you only picked up maybe 10% of the oxygen because that's all breathing could handle. And I never got exposure to anybody else. But if I were to go opposite, then I'd be able to get full, like sort of full saturation. So what happened is as I'm going by, then I see her, Haley, and then I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to exchange oxygen with her. So I fill you up, and now you're done and you're off. But then here comes Brayden, who's now empty, and I can fill you up, and then you pass by me, and you're done. So now both of you, instead of just having partial load, are fully loaded and going this direction. And then if John comes over here, then I fill him up, and he's full, and so forth. That's because you guys are going the opposite direction. So that's what the countercurrent multiplication system is. It's basically getting that extra exchange, that facilitation of exchange, because you're moving against each other and basically exchanging in addition to. So basically the countercurrent component is organized by the structure of the loop with your descending limb versus your ascending limb. The multiplication is referring to the exchange because you increase exchange by the counterflow. It's constantly interacting with a new stream of filtrate as it comes in. So it's that same kind of counterflow thing. You're constantly meeting somebody new because you're kind of passing by each other. So that increases exchange. And so everybody fills up. Now then, the segments of the loop are very close. So we're not talking about a gigantic loop. We're talking about a very, I mean, they're like right there next to each other. They have to be, right? Because if I basically was too far away from these guys, they wouldn't be able to exchange. I wouldn't be able to get it to them, right? So we have to be close so that exchange is efficient. So I can easily just get it to you, get it to you, get it to you. And that's close enough and efficient. However, even though they're close together, their permeability is very, very different. Permeability. In the descending limb, so that is the thin one, this is very permeable to water. However, it's impermeable to solutes. So what does this mean? It allows water out and nothing in. So it's a one-way trip. Now the thick ascending limb is different. It's impermeable to water and solutes as well. So nothing out, nothing in. However, what it has in it that's different than the descending limb is active transporters in there for sodium and chloride. It actually has sodium chloride pumps in the thick portion of the ascending limb. And these basically will pump sodium and chloride into that peritubular space. So when we take a look at these sodium chloride pumps, they're a little peculiar, right? So basically what these guys do, the effect of these guys, is to change the osmotic concentration of that peritubular fluid as it surrounds this thin descending limb. So this is creating, if you're keeping track, an osmotic lure environment around the descending limb. And what do we already know about the permeability of the descending limb? It allows water out, right? So what's going to happen if you basically dump a bunch of salt on the outside of that descending limb? It's going to suck the water out, right? That's exactly what you're going for. So this causes that osmotic flow of water out of the loop. And so you lose a lot of water in this case. This is the reason why you're reclaiming half of that water. That'll go into that peritubular space and they'll be taken up by your capillaries at that particular point. So essentially then, as you go down the loop, what you end up getting is a concentrated solution of filtrate. And then as it enters into that thick ascending limb, it's fairly concentrated, and this accelerates that sodium chloride pumping on the outside. Now, about the solute pumping. So the solute pumping is not just any kind of a pump. So here's your descending, here's your ascending. You have these pumps here in the ascending, and these guys are basically belting out sodium and chloride. The important thing is that these pumping is not all the same speed. There's an acceleration of solute pumping in the ascending limb. So these guys down here are faster pump rates than these guys up here. Part of that is because of the solute concentration in the descending limb. That increasing solute concentration speeds up these solute pumps, and then as it becomes less and less concentrated as it goes up, then it's going to slow those pumps down. So you have variable speed pumps. So what does that mean then? What does that give you? What that gives you then basically is a situation where there is a high concentration of solute down here versus a lower solute concentration at the top. So it stratifies your solute concentration. We'll take a look at that here in just a second. So this is just review from AMP1 in general bio. If you took it, right, this is our sodium, potassium, and chloride transporters, and I toss chloride in it. It's a different one than sodium potassium. So it's going to be moving sodium and potassium, but also a chloride out of the tubular fluid. So essentially it exchanges a sodium and potassium for 2 chlorides as a transporter. And then what you end up getting is 1 sodium ion, 1 potassium ion, and 2 chloride ions in opposite directions. So this is kind of what it looks like So here you can see your sodium and your potassium are moving in, your two chlorides are moving in, which makes sense, right? Is everything balanced there? Yeah, because you just brought in two positive charges. So you bring in two negative charges in order to keep everything neutral. So right, notice how you're always thinking about charge balance whenever you're doing this. So then those three will then be involved in all sorts of stuff. For instance, the chloride and the potassium will co-transport in the paratubular fluid. The sodium will be involved in a sodium potassium pump, which will bring potassium in where it'll leak into the tubular fluid. But basically here what's happened ultimately, your net is you've essentially used potassium. It's circled all the way around. So notice potassium started out in the tubular fluid, right, in the filtrate. It came in through this sodium potassium chloride pump. It got put into the paratubular fluid, but then it turned right around and through a sodium potassium pump went right back into the tubular cell and then right back into the filtrate. So potassium is this circular mechanism. And then ultimately what you end up net gaining is one chloride and one sodium. So this is your sodium chloride pump that's in your thick ascending limb. Okay, so basically this is the blab slide for everything we just mentioned there. Basically potassium just sort of circles back around in a sort of cyclic structure. Sodium and chloride are then moved into the paratubular fluid around the descending limb. Now, the descending limb, which is permeable to water and impermeable to solutes, basically osmotically, the water will move into the paratubular fluid being sucked out by the sodium chloride concentration that we just created with our sodium chloride pumps. And so in this case, osmotic concentration will increase because you are losing water inside the filtrate. So the tubular fluid, which is the filtrate, will increase in concentration because of the loss of water, right? This is kind of like making that reduction. You're kind of bubbling off the liquid in your sauce, thickening it up. It's thickening it up. It's getting more concentrated because you're bubbling off the water. So the same thing's true here. So you're increasing your concentration. This is what it looks like. So this is basically what the overall. Let's take a look at this. So coming from the proximal convoluted tubule, which is up here, the filtrate pressure, the osmotic pressure of the filtrate is 300 milliosmoles per liter. Now, you don't need to like lose sleep over that one. Basically, a milliosmole per liter is a measure of the osmotic pressure, so the concentration, if you will, of a fluid. So the lower that number, the more dilute the concentration. The higher that number, the more concentrated the solution. So what happens is the consequence of these sodium chloride channels or these sodium chloride pumps that are pumping out sodium and chloride at variable speeds. Remember, these guys are fast and these guys up here are slow. What this means is then that you're going to basically get this sort of ladder-like structure of solutes around this tubular system. So for instance, up here by the proximal convoluted tubule, the concentration of the paratubular space is going to be 300, very similar to what's inside the proximal convoluted tubule. But then as you start to move down, because of the activity of sodium chloride pumps, it's going to be more concentrated because of the excess salt in there. So it's going to be 600 milliosmoles, which is a stronger suck because there's a bigger salt concentration there due to these pumps. And as you kind of get further down, it goes into 900, so it's getting saltier still. And then 1200, even saltier, the saltiest that it gets. So what you get is basically this osmotic ladder. Now, let's take a look and see what the consequences are on the descending limb. We know that it's permeable to water, impermeable to solutes. So as this 300 milliosmoles then comes into the descending loop, what's going to happen is basically just osmosis. So as your 300 milliosmoles gets into the area where it's outside, it's going to be 600. Then by osmosis, your natural flow of water is going to go where? It's going to go out, right? So it's going to basically leave the tubule until your internal concentration becomes the same as the external, 600. But guess what? You still move down. So now all of a sudden 600 sees 900. So now what's going to happen? You're going to lose more water, right? And then until you become 900. And then you keep going down, and then 900 sees 1200, and what? You're going to lose more water, right? So basically what happens is the nature of this osmotic ladder is to sort of stepwise, progressively wring out more and more and more water. And so ultimately, once you get down to the bottom of the loop, you're at about 1200 milliosmoles. So this is very concentrated filtrate at this particular point. Now then, it'll start going up, and notice how a lot of times students will ask this question. Well, it's like, wait a minute. So you go from 1200 to 900. So what, did you bring on more water? No, because remember the ascending is impermeable to water and solutes. So it's not water that did this. What happens here is a change in the nature of the solutes. We'll see that here in just a second. So it's just a change in the way these solutes are in this particular area. It's an internal change in these solutes that causes this change. But it's at about 900 as it moves into the ascending, and then you start dumping sodium chloride, and that sodium chloride is reducing your dissolved solutes, which means you're making it more and more dilute. So it gets back up to 300, and then as it gets higher, you basically come to 100. So you've dumped out a lot of sodium and a lot of chloride from in this particular system. Now, once you get up to here, now you're ready to move into the distal convoluted tubule. So then, this ascending loop is really, really, really efficient, obviously, right? Because you go from 1200 milliosmoles at the bottom of the loop to 100. That's basically a 10-fold offload of solute. That's pretty impressive, okay? So it's obviously very effective. You're basically getting about 2/3 of your sodium chloride basically pumped into the peritubular tissue for uptake before you even get to the distal convoluted tubule. By the way, what this means is before we get to the aldosterone ADH site of activity. A few slides back, we said that aldosterone works with the DCT. We haven't even gotten there yet, and we've already got 2/3 of our sodium. So this is kind of what it looks like in all of its horrendousness and beauty at the same time. So here we have our PCT coming in at about 300 milliosmoles. It's going to be going down the loop, right, the descending loop, where you're going to be wringing out all of your water. Now, a couple of things I want you to pay attention to here now is because of solutes. So we have a couple of different metrics in solutes here. So we have the little purple circles, which are sodium, the little green circles, which are chloride, and then the little brown ones are urea. And a lot of times I want to sort of explain what urea's role is here, because nobody ever talks about urea really, but it's an important component, okay? So as you're starting to lose water, notice you're starting to get a much more condensed grouping of solutes of sodium, chloride, and urea. All three of these things are making up the solutes that gives you your osmotic concentration, okay? Then as you go through the ascending, you start to offload your sodium and your chloride. Now notice what's happening up here. As you get up to 300 in your ascending, notice now what you have is less sodium and less chloride, but your urea is still there. So the urea doesn't really change, right? So this is what I mean by there's a change in your internal solutes, right? So the urea, oftentimes I refer to as an osmotic balancer. And basically what that means is it keeps the osmotic pressure from going to 0. Because remember, you need still a little bit of pressure to be able to move fluids through this, right? So what happens then is what happens if you get rid of all your solutes? That's like 0 osmotic pressure now, right? What's the point now? You don't urinate anything. So you're not getting rid of anything. So the urea is there to maintain a minimal level of osmotic pressure so that it can continue to move forward. That's the reason why it goes down to 100, mostly caused by urea at this particular point. And of course, all the dissolved stuff in it, right? All your waste products and things like that. But when you're just looking at these three, this is mostly a component of urea. So you kind of keep from crashing too far below that number, because otherwise it's just going to stop dead in the water. It's going to be like a placid lake. There's not going to be any flow through or movement. Then you're ready to go through your distal convoluted tubule, which is this guy right here. And then once it goes through your distal convoluted tubule, remember you go through that same osmotic ladder again. And in this case, you have the collecting duct, which is has a portion of it that's permeable to water, perhaps, and so more water exits. And then most of the collecting duct is impermeable to urea, except for the lower region, which is called the papillary duct. This becomes permeable to urea, and now urea is able to respond to its concentration gradient, and so it exits the duct by diffusion, and then it can go right back in and enter into the filtrate and sort of help keep things balanced. So it's kind of cycling through. So you don't really urinate out a whole ton of urea. You're not supposed to. It's supposed to cycle from the collecting duct. It gets retaken back up and goes reinserted back into the urine stream so that it can keep these pressures balanced and keep them from crashing. So it's cycling through the system completely. So then, now once we are done with the loop, it's time to start moving toward the DCT. So what arrives at the DCT is an osmotic concentration of 100 milliosmoles per liter. This is a third of the concentration of the peritubular fluid, right? So 300 to 100. And then ultimately this is caused by that ion, the ion transport in the ascending limb, right? So that's basically what it's caused by. A couple of regional differences. So the sodium chloride are going to be pumped into the medulla. That's the tissue, right? But the important thing to remember is the sodium chloride doesn't just hang out there, right? In these peritubular tissues, the stuff doesn't hang out there when you reabsorb it. It moves into the capillaries, right? The idea is you don't want it to just bog down into this sort of no man's land. You want it to move through. So that means that once you dump the sodium chloride into that peritubular region, it needs to move into the bloodstream and then get back in there, which is the reason why you have to keep these pumps going. They constantly have to replace that sodium chloride. It doesn't just hang out there, right? It's kind of circulating through. And so this is also just a reiteration of the difference in the transport rates, right? So the more deeper pumps are faster in terms of their rate than the more peripheral pumps. And that's what creates the ladder. That's what creates that sort of osmotic ladder, that 300, 600, 900, 1200 milliosmol ladder that's critical to be able to sort of suck out progressively more amounts of water. So ultimately then, when you take a look at your filtrate, the max concentration you get down to is 1200 milliosmoles. 2/3 of that is from sodium and chloride, which is then pumped out of the ascending limb. So this basically means that this is why it goes down to 100 milliosmoles per liter. The remainder of that pressure, so it's 1/3 of it is sodium chloride and the rest of it is urea. Okay. So what they're talking about is what the components of milliosmole per liter, what those components are at the distal convoluted tubule, what's causing that. So this is basically kind of what they showed in images. So basically, as you're going down the collecting duct, so you can move from the ascending limb to the DCT, the collecting ducts are impermeable to urea until you get to the papillary region, which is permeable to urea. But ultimately, water can be reabsorbed in this upper region. And as it's absorbed, the concentration of urea rises, which increases the concentration of the filtrate. And then once it reaches a papillary duct, ultimately then it's able to move out. And that's what causes or forces urea to move out. So that loss of water in the upper region of the collecting duct is basically what forces, so that water leaving increases the concentration. And then that increase in urea concentration is what allows the urea to exit by diffusion once it hits that papillary region. Okay, so the benefits of countercurrent multiplication is the efficiency, clearly the efficiency. It reabsorbs solutes in water really, really well. You couldn't do this as well without it. It also, in this particular case, establishes the concentration gradient, which forces the exchange. So this gives you greater reabsorption by kind of forcing this sort of counterflow situation. So then at this particular point now, once we're ready to move into the DCT, your fluid, your filtrate, has changed a lot from the capsular space where it was mostly plasma-like to the distal convoluted tubule. So about a quarter or so of your initial filtrate reaches the DCT. So that's it. At this particular point, most of your electrolytes, organic waste, and things like that have been changed. Either they've been added to or taken from, but there's been so many modifications at this particular point, things that you've dumped in there, things that you pulled out, that it no longer resembles your blood plasma. So it is now very much more like urine. Okay, so let's take a look at the DCT. The DCT basically now, your final stretch. This is your last chance to make final additions and subtractions to the filtrate. So here now you're kind of cherry picking through your reabsorption, your secretion. And so these are your final tweaks before you perfect the urine, right? After this, most of what's going to happen is it's going to exit the body. So it's ready for elimination at this particular point. Now, generally speaking, the DCT will have sodium chloride transporters. So pulling out even more sodium chloride out of the filtrate. So they have lots of ion pumps, mostly for sodium and chloride and also for sodium and potassium. This is the site of aldosterone activity. So the adrenal cortex obviously will produce lots of aldosterone under the direction of angiotensin II. Aldosterone is actually a controller of ion pumps and channels. This is basically how it acts. This is the way that it actually retains sodium. And so ultimately, it will basically cause these sodium pumps to turn on. It'll upregulate these sodium pumps, and then it'll cause the uptake of sodium, which results in a loss of sodium in urine because you're taking it all up. Now that's reabsorption, right? So secretion in the DCT, typically speaking, this is stuff that will go into those paratubular capillaries. So for instance, this is waste products. So it'll dump extra waste. Things that didn't make it across the filtration membrane. So you'll dump these here in the DCT. For instance, hydrogen secretion and potassium secretion will rise and fall depending on what you need. And so this depends on what you already see in those paratubular spaces. If you already see very like a deficiency in potassium, that's going to favor potassium exiting the filtrate and moving into that space. Same thing with the hydrogen. So the hydrogen basically is a final adjuster on pH. Just to make sure that everything is right. So ultimately, in the potassium and hydrogen perspective, the potassium will move into the lumen through leak channels, and then they will exchange with sodium in a sodium potassium sort of mechanism. So here's what it looks like for the DCT. So these are the distal convoluted tubule cells. And so this is what you normally have here. So basically you have a sodium chloride channel bringing in a sodium from the filtrate and a chloride from the filtrate. They're both coming in by active transport. They diffuse through the cell through the dotted lines, where the chloride will go through a leak channel, diffuse out, and it'll diffuse into the bloodstream. Okay, so you've reclaimed your chloride. The sodium will basically go through a sodium potassium pump and will be exchanged for a potassium. So the potassium will go in, the sodium will come out into the bloodstream, and then the potassium will basically leak out through a leak channel and enter into the filtrate for elimination. This is what's normally happening, right? So this is normal. Once angiotensin 2 turns on and it starts to create and stimulate aldosterone, aldosterone basically is a mechanism by which you essentially will use potassium. So here you can see potassium enters into the distal convoluted tubule cell with an exchange of sodium. So you bring sodium into the blood. But basically it does the same thing on the other end. So it's going to basically take a potassium and exchange it for a sodium. That sodium will then be exchanged for another potassium, which will enter the blood. So you're using potassium as a trade. Here, I'll give you a potassium, give me your sodium, and I'll hold on to it. So what it's doing then is it's increasing the sodium concentration in the blood, which is exactly what we said it did, right? It basically was part of sodium retention. That's what it does for a living. Now, the important thing is, what's on the left-hand side is what happens normally, even in the absence of aldosterone. So you're always uptaking sodium at this basal rate. But then once you get a blood pressure crash and you start to trigger the RAS system and angiotensin 2 turns on aldosterone, then you take what's on the left hand and you add to it what's on the right hand. So the aldosterone mechanism is all of your normal sodium pumping, like you see on the left, plus the extra aldosterone driven pumps that increases your rate and capacity for retaining sodium. Then once your blood pressure kind of evens out, then you can turn off the aldosterone stimulated pumps, and then all you have is your maintenance pumps on the left hand side. So the right hand side represents an upregulation mechanism for increasing the amount of sodium that you can take in. So that's basically what we said here, right? So basically hydrogen ion is part of that dissociation of carbonic anhydrase is carbonic acid dissociated. And then ultimately what's going to happen is this hydrogen ion is going to be secreted with sodium. So it's going to be basically moved with the sodium powering it. So this is a counter transport. Sodium is going to come in, hydrogen ion is going to go back out. And then ultimately the bicarbonate will diffuse into the bloodstream to get rid of that negative charge lingering over, so you have a balance of charge. And this basically changes the blood pH. The combination of hydrogen ion leaving the blood versus bicarbonate coming into the blood evens out that blood pH. So basically what's going to happen is ultimately you're going to acidify your urine. This is basically why urine is between 6 and 6.5 normally, is because of this. It's going to elevate your blood pH, and it's going to increase when your pH falls. That is when it gets acidic, right? The idea is you get rid of that excess hydrogen because you're already too acidic, And not only that, but you do the double whammy. You bring in your bicarbonate ion to alkalinize your blood. So here's what it looks like. So here's your carbonate buffer system. You can see your carbonic acid. It's associating into bicarbonate and hydrogen. Now, if you have too much hydrogen in your bloodstream here, then what's going to happen is that's going to basically diffuse out of your capillary. It's going to interact with this sodium hydrogen transporter, which will then diffuse to another sodium hydrogen transporter, and that'll basically expel it into the filtrate. That's where your hydrogen is now. Now, the problem is, since you've moved a positive charge, you have to balance that out. So you do that by basically taking your bicarb that's left over, and you essentially move that into the bloodstream with an exchange of chloride in order to balance that negative charge, right? Because you don't want to basically have a negative charge differential. So that's where this chloride shift comes into play. Chloride shift is essentially anytime you use a chloride in order to balance charge. That's basically what it is. And then the chloride, once it comes in, can just basically enter into the filtrate through a leak channel. Now, on this other side, you notice you also have a couple other things going on, a bicarb situation. This is from amino acid deamination. So when you deaminate an amino acid, which you do a lot actually, you create that amino group is going to basically turn into an ammonium ion, which is NH4+. That's very, very basic, very strongly basic. So you want to get rid of that one. And so you do, but you basically have a counter transport with sodium. Notice you're using sodium as a lever. It's like a counterbalance for all these things. So there's already three different mechanisms, three different roles for sodium ion in your body, right? Basically, it's the governing ion for your nervous system, right? Action potential. That's number one. Number two is its osmotic lure. That's number two. Number three is it's basically one of these energetic counterbalances for co-transport and counter-transport. So you use a sodium basically to counter-transport out your ammonium, and then the leftover bicarb that's here will leak out to balance off that excessive negative charge with a chloride shift to balance out your charge, and that chloride will leak out into your filtrate. So what's going on here? A lot. So you're accumulating sodium, number one. You're balancing your pH, number two. And you're basically getting rid of nitrogenous waste in your ammonium ion from deamination of a protein. This is all happening in the distal convoluted tubule. Oh, but we're not done. Please be done. We're not, right? Because we still have to talk about ADH. We talked about aldosterone, but now what about ADH, right? What does ADH do? Okay, so first of all, we know that ADH is responsible for water retention, right? So basically it increases the osmotic flow of water. But how does it do that? Well, how it does that is very simple. All it does is increases the number of aquaporins. What's an aquaporin? It's the channel that allows water to move through it, right? So it's very simple. Aldosterone is creating the motive force, the reason to move. ADH is simply creating the access. So the two of it goes together. You have to have the will to do something and then the means to do it. Aldosterone creates the will by piling up the salt inside your bloodstream. ADH creates the means, right? So once you have an open door, it's going to open the door to water flow. So ADH will increase your aquaporins, which will increase the permeability of the DCT and the collecting cells. So that's basically what's happening. So ultimately here, then the concentration of your osmotic fluid coming into the DC is 100 milliosmoles. In the presence of ADH, it's 300 milliosmoles. And in the minor calyx, which you would expect because it's the tip of the renal pelvis, it's going to be 1200 milliosmoles, right? Because that's down there toward that salty tip, that salty end of the situation. Now, without ADH, water does not get absorbed. All the fluid, the water that normally would have been retained during ADH is now lost in the urine. So this is going to be basically a dilute urine, and which is fine if you're trying to offload fluids, right? Not so fine if you're dehydrated and you're trying to hang on to your fluids. This is kind of what it looks like. So we're going to take a look at two different images. So this is what we saw already before. This is kind of our normal flow through, and then we're going to take a look at it with ADH. So we're going to look at both of these. So here you can see you've got basically your filtrate coming into your PCT. This is coming in at about 300 milliosmoles. As it enters the descending loop, which is permeable to water but not to solutes, it's going to basically get sucked out because of this osmotic ladder that's created by the ascending loop. It's going to suck all this water out osmotically so that the filtrate is getting more and more concentrated as it comes around the tip. As it comes around the tip, then it's going to be moving into the thick ascending region, which is going to be starting to pump out heavily sodium chloride, more so at the bottom, at faster rates at the bottom, slower rates as you get to the top. And this is going to reinforce that osmotic ladder. So you're going to be generating more solutes at the bottom, making it more concentrated, than at the top, making it less concentrated. That creates your ladder. And then as you start to move up, your pressure comes down to 100 milliosmoles. And then you do your normal sodium exchange with aldosterone, yes or no. And so you kind of do your normal back and forth, your pH adjustments, your ammonium adjustments, all those sorts of things. So all that's happening. And then you go down your collecting duct, which generally speaking is not permeable to water. And then it just goes all the way through your collecting duct. So you have large amounts of dilute urine. Okay, so this is a situation when you're well hydrated. As a result, you can actually tell when you're well hydrated, can't you, when you urinate? Because your urine comes out fairly colorless. That basically means there's a reduction in the amount of dissolved things in your urine, which means it's mostly water or a high volume of water, which means you're doing pretty good hydration wise. Okay. Now, what if you happen to have dehydration? This is basically where you're starting to trip all these pressure responses with angiotensin 2. It's going to basically open up aldosterone and ADH. Notice you go through the same process through the descending loop where you suck out all the water, the ascending loop where basically you recapitulate the osmotic ladder and your osmotic concentration begins to lower, and now you're at 100. So you're at the same place once you hit the distal convoluted tubule. But now what happens is you turn on all these aldosterone motivated pumps. So you're retaining now more sodium, and none of that, but you're increasing ADH, which opens up these little aquaporin channels all over the place to allow water to chase that salt that you're retaining with the aldosterone mechanism. Okay, those aldosterone pumps. So you're getting more water, and as you go down the collecting duct, what was impermeable to water, now you're dropping in all of these aquaporins in there. So now all this water is able to come out. So you're leaching all this water out at the same time when you're going down the osmotic ladder. So this water is doing exactly the same thing in the collecting duct now in the presence of ADH that it was doing in the descending loop of Henle. Because in the presence of ADH makes the collecting duct permeable to water, similar to the descending limb of the loop. So it's a similar sort of a situation, only now you're sucking all the water out of the collecting duct. So ultimately then what you end up getting is a greater and greater concentration of filtrate. So you get a small volume of concentrated urine. And we've all seen that before, haven't we? When you basically are dehydrated, you have a little bit of urine and it's very concentrated, very dark in color. Okay, that's basically you had a bunch of ADH that was firing off there. So you're retaining all of your fluids. So basically then when you take a look at renal function, you kind of pull it all together. You have basically 7 basic steps. First one obviously starts the glomerulus with filtration. So you basically go through filtration, you create the filtrate in the renal corpuscle, and then once it enters into the tubular system, then it's off to the proximal convoluted tubule, which basically is responsible for taking back a lot of organic solutes and things of that nature, a lot of sodium as well. But it reduces the volume of the filtrate by a lot, right? That's about 2/3, almost 3/4. And then basically from the PCT, it moves into the descending limb. And basically here you're looking at water absorption, right? That's basically what you're looking at here. So you're sucking back a lot of that water. So a ton of your water, most of your water is going to be absorbed in this descending limb. As you round the bend, then as you go up the ascending limb, your job is to transport sodium and chloride out of the tubule, basically reclaiming your sodium and chloride, but also creating that osmotic ladder. And then from the DCT, so from the thick ascending limb, you go into the DCT where you make your final adjustments to your urine, your final secretions, your final reabsorptions. This is also where you have your ADH and your aldosterone active in those particular situations. And then as you start to move into the collecting duct, ADH is also active here in terms of allowing water to exit the collecting duct. Now, the one thing we haven't talked about that we're going to talk about now, number 7, is the vasa recta. So the vasa recta basically is the capillary network around the loop of Henle. So just like we had the paratubular capillaries taking whatever you reabsorbed from the paratubular space and putting it back in the blood, the vasa recta does the same thing for the loop itself. Okay. And so that's kind of what maintains that concentration gradient the same, because the salt pile doesn't just keep piling up. It just circulates and just gets taken into the vasa recta while the pumps replace it. So you always have a constant amount of concentration. So that's kind of what it looks like. So here's your vasa recta here. So you can see as the water comes out, it doesn't just hang out in the paratubular space. It goes right into the vasa recta, which is a part of the capillary system. You can see up here, this is your paratubular capillary. So all the proximal convoluted tubule reabsorptions and nutrients and things like that will come into the space first, and then they will move into this paratubular capillary and be taken up into the bloodstream. The water from the loop will come out into the paratubular space, and then we'll move into the vasa recta, and then back into the cardiovascular system, okay, on its way, in this case, to the heart. So this is the descending side of it. This is the ascending side of it. So you can see the paratubular capillary comes down and crosses over the DCT. So it picks up stuff from the DCT, and then it turns into what we refer to as the vasa recta. So basically it kind of jumps down and then wraps around the bottom side of the loop. So the descending loop is here. So the vasa recta just basically continues on over here. But you can see how it's a continuation of that paratubular capillary system. So where did the paratubular capillary come from? The efferent arteriole. So that's where it came from. So this is basically coming out of and from the glomerulus. That's where this is coming from. So it basically circulates back into that bloodstream and then heads off to the heart. So all the things that you're reabsorbing all goes into the paratubular space. Like the sodium chloride, for instance, will move into the paratubular space, but then it'll immediately move into the vasa recta. So that means you have to pump more in there in order to replace it to maintain that osmotic pressure. Okay. It's also picking up water from the collecting duct or sodium from aldosterone. So it's picking all of that up. So the vasa recta basically is picking up all of these reabsorptions, these things that are getting dumped from the filtrate into the paratubular space. The vasa recta comes in here, picks it all up, and it re-enters into your bloodstream, and then it heads off to your circulatory system to be recirculated. And that, I know what you're thinking. Please say it's over. That's the end of the semester. Except for Monday. Don't go away. You still have to go on, you still have to show up on Monday. But that's the end of it, right? Yeah. No. Urinary is the big one that I want to cover. Everything else, like if we're like way ahead of schedule, then I'll like open up development or something like that. But we